In this video, we are explaining the Monroe Doctrine that was put in place by President James Monroe in 1823. Now, this is a very important doctrine that has really shaped U.S. foreign policy since then. Obviously, some presidents have used it more than the others, but of late, we're beginning to see the exertion of this doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. So what is this doctrine and how has it impacted the Western Hemisphere and even beyond? All right, so let's take a look at this closely. But first, who was President James Monroe? So he was president from 1817 to 1825. He was president for 2 terms, 8 years. And he was the 5th president of the United States. Now, this is significant because the suggestion then is, being just the 5th, that the United States was a new country, still trying to exert itself amongst the community of nations. The United States gained its independence in 1776. So in 1823, it would have been just 47 years old, not even celebrating the golden anniversary, as they say. Right, so it was still a young country trying to exert itself amongst the community of nations, amongst countries that have been around much longer, older countries like Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, etc. So try to exert itself. And so President Monroe comes up with this doctrine. And it's very interesting to note this because Monroe himself was very, very influential in domestic affairs as well as in international affairs. And you will recall that Monrovia, Liberia, was named after James Monroe because of his role in sending the slaves over there. This is a very important doctrine, and let's take a closer look at it. The Monroe Doctrine, then, articulated by President James Monroe in 1823, was, right, and continues to be a very important U.S. foreign policy. And here is the point, aimed at curbing European colonialism in the Americas. The incursion of the European countries in the Western Hemisphere was a concern to President James Monroe at the time. As we know, Spanish colonized much of Latin America and, of course, Portugal in Brazil. This doctrine then was suggesting that, listen, we are in the Western Hemisphere and you have no business here. We will dominate in the Western Hemisphere and we will have the term hegemony, right, hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And this is the crust of the Monroe Doctrine. Don't interfere in the Western Hemisphere and we will not interfere in Europe. Right? And that was the understanding, and that was the core of the doctrine, ensuring that the United States maintained hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, domination in other words, and Europe stays away, and the United States will not go to Europe and dominate countries over there. Right, so the Monroe Doctrine, then articulated by President James Monroe in 1823, was and continues to be. Obviously, some presidents have used it more than the others, but of late we're beginning to see the exertion of this doctrine. Right, so the pivotal U.S. policy aimed at curbing European colonialism in the Americas, and again the focus being on Spain and Portugal that have come into the Western Hemisphere, specifically in Latin American countries, to have colonies and impact those countries in many ways, culturally, leaving their language behind. The United States was very, very concerned about that and wanted to ensure that the Monroe Doctrine contained that. Right? So the key principles of the Monroe Doctrine are very clear. There are 4 main key principles, and let's take a look at those now. Non-colonization is the first one, so let's highlight that here. Non-colonization. The doctrine asserted that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization. Not anymore. Now, this is coming very late because the Spanish had been there long before 1823 and had done the damage essentially. Gone to the big countries like Argentina and Colombia and Ecuador and Venezuela and other countries like Peru, Chile. They are all influenced by, even today, influenced by Spain. And the language there is Spanish. Right? And this is very interesting. So this doctrine was coming very late, but nevertheless, President James Monroe saw it fit to put in place this doctrine to warn Spain and Portugal to stay clear and to cease their continuous influence and involvement in the Western Hemisphere. So non-colonization was a core principle of this doctrine. The doctrine asserted that the Americas were no longer open to European colonization and any attempt by European powers. And here we are talking about Spain, we are talking about Portugal, principally. right? These were the two countries that had impact, right? So here again, it says any attempt by European powers to extend their influence in the Western Hemisphere will be viewed as a threat to the United States, as a threat to the United States security, as a threat to the U.S. security, because the suggestion is you're coming to my house to have influence, right, when I haven't gone to your house to have similar influence. The import of this doctrine is non-colonization of the Western Hemisphere. Stay clear, and we will not go into Europe, right? So this is one of the core principles of the Monroe Doctrine. The second one is non-intervention. And what is that? It says here, it emphasized that the United States will not interfere in the internal affairs of European nations or their existing colonies. However, it reserved the right to oppose European intervention in the Americas, right? So here we're saying that we give you a deal. We will not interfere in your affairs. We will not interfere not only in your affairs, but also in the affairs of your colonies. We will not do that. If you respect our boundaries, essentially, right? If you respect our boundaries, right? So we will, right? It says here, it reserved the right to oppose European intervention in the Americas. So while we will not interfere in European affairs and in the affairs of the colony, we will intervene if Europe comes to the Western Hemisphere with colonial tendencies, with economic interest. It's making it very clear their position regarding European influence and European intervention in the Western Hemisphere. And thirdly, political independence is another core principle of the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine encouraged the independence of newly sovereign nations in Latin America. Independence from who? From Portugal, from Spain, principally. Asserting that the United States will support these nations against European aggression. So here then, not only the United States is saying that we will intervene. If you come to the Western Hemisphere, we will resist it. It is saying that we will support your colonies to gain independence and be politically independent and be sovereign and ensure that they are on their own and they detach essentially from countries that have colonized them, Spain and Portugal, again, principally. And so political independence is key here. The doctrine encouraged the independence, this is key, of newly sovereign nations in Latin America. And those nations, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, Uruguay, Bolivia, Venezuela, and Peru, Chile, and the list is long, etc. Those nations then will be independent. And if there is any interference in their affairs, the United States will support those countries to stand on their own. And then, fourthly, the U.S. influence. It positioned the United States as the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, signaling its intention to protect its interest in the region, right? So every country seeks to protect its interest, its influence, and the United States not any different. Countries around the world often protect their interest, right? And their interest sometimes goes well beyond their borders and it impacts others, right? So the United States trying to justify that it is the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere is saying that we will protect our interests. So they are seeing the Western Hemisphere, the entire Western Hemisphere, this is Western Hemisphere, as their interest, as part of their interest, hemisphere, as part of their interest. So any incursion by foreign powers into this space, essentially is encroaching, according to the Monroe Doctrine, and as seen by President James Monroe, into United States space. And by so doing, influencing its policy and impacting and intervening in its affairs. So this is the view, and this is the idea of the Monroe Doctrine that has been in place all of these years and has been used sometimes sparingly by some presidents, but more so recently we have seen the assertion of this principle in the Western Hemisphere. And we saw the example with the invasion of Venezuela and the suggestion that no other country should come in and take over, that the United States will be the country that will run Venezuela until a time when Venezuelans can put together a credible election. And so the idea here then is the Chinese and the Russians shouldn't come in because that would be an affront to the United States. And we saw another example with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where the Soviet Union had placed missiles in Cuba and, very close to the United States, that almost transitioned into the Third World War. President John Kennedy threatening to take action if those missiles were not taken off, with Cuba being only 19 miles from the United States, right? Florida, to be specific. That was seen as an incursion into the Western Hemisphere by a foreign power, in this case, the Soviet Union. The Monroe Doctrine then was a response to various European powers' intention to reclaim territories in Latin America following the decline of the Spanish rule. So the United States was saying that, no, you will not do that. Time has passed for that. It reflected the growing American nationalism, right? And this is very important. So let's put that here, right? Because one of its core aspect was nationalism. And nationalism here extending beyond the borders of the United States. And the belief in the manifest destiny, right? The idea that the U.S. was destined to expand its territories and influence. So the U.S. had expansionist tendencies then as well. And this doctrine was also laced with that. Not just don't interfere, but we will be the ones to extend our powers and our influence in the Western Hemisphere. So it was manifest, right? So the manifest doctrine, the idea that the U.S. was destined to expand its territory and influence, was also very significant to the grand purpose and intention and objective of the Monroe Doctrine. And of course, the Monroe Doctrine laid the foundation for U.S. foreign policy in the Americas, influencing later the policies and interventions through the 19th and the 20th century. Now, this is very significant. Now, we are talking about many, many decades now of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, it's up to debate to see whether that influence is really working at this point, with countries exerting themselves, big countries like Brazil, with big economies, Argentina, etc., really exerting themselves and competing in their own rights. Does the U.S. still have influence over those countries? Now, that's debatable. But the intent of the Monroe Doctrine is not debatable because it's very clear. So the Monroe Doctrine laid the foundation for U.S. foreign policies in the Americas, influencing later policies and interventions throughout the 19th and the 20th century. So, but again, there's been controversies. In spite of all of this, there's been controversies about this doctrine. It has been interpreted in various ways, sometimes to justify intervention in Latin America. So we saw the intervention in Chile with the involvement of the United States in the overthrow of that government of Salvador Allende of Chile, who was democratically elected, but had leftist tendencies, and he was overthrown in Chile. And again, see the Monroe Doctrine playing out in this context. So there's been controversies because this doctrine has been used to justify intervention. All of this is important to understand the key role of the Monroe Doctrine and its impact, which is playing a crucial role in shaping the political landscape of the Americas. Very important. Shaping the political landscape of the Americas, and the relationship between U.S. and European powers, also shaping that, and setting boundaries and telling the European powers that you can reign supreme in Europe, but forget about the Western Hemisphere. It established a precedent for U.S. engagement in the Western Hemisphere that continues to resonate in contemporary international relations, that continue today, is still very significant and still very used. And like I said earlier, some presidents have used it more than the others, but nevertheless, still used and still impactful, as we saw on January the 2nd, 2026, with the invasion of Venezuela and the capture of its president and the First Lady. So this is a Monroe Doctrine, a doctrine that has been around for decades, and a doctrine that has really defined the United States foreign policy for all of this time, and ensuring that the United States has hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, and foreign powers like France and the Soviet Union, now Russia, and other powers, China, don't have as much influence in the region. The question is the Monroe Doctrine very effective at other powers in the region? We know that China is in Latin America. China is doing business with Latin American countries. They're getting oil. Iran, for example, is dealing with Venezuela. It's getting much of its petroleum from Venezuela. And other countries as well are coming to the region to do business and engage. So is the Monroe Doctrine effective today? And that is the question before us, to begin to understand and begin to look at this critically and begin to see all of the different interplays of power of China and Russia in the region, with Cuba leaning towards the left and other countries leaning towards the right. And all of these playing out in real time and challenging in many ways the Monroe Doctrine.